from George Ivanovich Gurdjieff's All and Everything. Chapter 34. Reading 3. Russia. After this unforgettable, supreme presentation of mine, I very soon left St. Petersburg for other parts of the continent of Europe, and began to have, as the chief places of my existence, various cities of the countries which were situated both on that same continent, Europe, as well as on other continents. I was again later, many times, but for other affairs, in the same community, Russia, where during that period of the flow of time, their great process there of reciprocal destruction took place, and the destruction of everything already attained by them, which this time, as I have already told you, was called by them Bolshevism. You remember I promised to relate to you about the fundamental real causes of this arch-phenomenal process. Well, it is necessary to tell you that this grievous phenomenon arises there thanks to two independent factors, the first of which is the cosmic law soli nensius, and the second is always the same abnormal conditions of ordinary being existence, established by them themselves. In order that you should the better understand about both these factors, I will explain to you about each of them separately, and will begin by the cosmic law soli nensius. First of all, you must be told that all the three-brained beings, on whatever planet they may arise, and whatever exterior coating they may receive, always await the manifestations of the action of this law with impatience and with joy, somewhat how your favorites await what are called their feasts of Easter, Bairam, Zadik, Ramadan, Kailana, and so on. The only difference is in this, that your favorites await these feasts of theirs with impatience, because on these holy days it has become customary among them to allow themselves to be more jolly and to booze freely, while the beings of the other planets await the action of soli nensius with impatience, because, thanks to it, the need for evolving, in the sense of the acquiring of objective reason by them, increases in them by itself. As regards the causes which bring forth this same action of this cosmic law, they are for each planet different, and always flow from and depend upon what is called the common cosmic harmonious movement. Moreover, frequently for your planet Earth, what is called the center of gravity of causes is the periodic tension of the sun of its system, which tension proceeds in its turn thanks to the influence upon this sun of a neighboring solar system, which exists under the name of Baliuto. In this latter system, however, such a center of gravity of causes arises because among the number of its concentrations there is a great comet Solney, which, according to certain known combinations of the common cosmic harmonious movement, at times approaches on its falling very near to its sun Baliauto, which is forced by this to make a strong tension in order to maintain the path of its own falling. This tension provokes the tension of the suns of the neighboring systems, among the number of which is the system Ors. And when the sun, Ors, strains itself not to change its path of falling inherent to it, this sun, Ors, in its turn provokes the same tension in all the concentrations of its own system, among which is also the planet Earth. The tension in all the planets acts also on the common presences of all beings, arising and breeding on them, always engendering in the beings, besides desires and intentions of which they are not aware, the feeling called sacred ia boliunosar, or as your favorites would say, the feeling of religiousness, namely, that being feeling which at times appears in the desire and striving for, as I have already said, speedier self-perfecting in the sense of objective reason. It is interesting that when this sacred feeling, or another similar to it, which was also engendered by a certain common cosmic actualization, proceeds in the common presences of your favorites, then they accept it as a symptom of certain of their numerous diseases, and in the given case, for example, they call this feeling nerves. It is necessary to remark that such an impulse inherent in the presence of all three-brained beings of our great universe formerly arose and became actualized almost normally in the majority of terrestrial beings of that time, namely, from the time of the removal of the organ Kundabuffer from the common presences of the three-brained beings of the planet Earth, right up to the second Transapolnian perturbation. But later, among the number of chief evils which flow from the conditions of ordinary being existence established by them themselves, especially when in the presences of every terrestrial three-brained being, there began to become predominant the evil inner God of theirs I mentioned, named there self-calming. Then it occurred that in them, under the influence of the action of Solunensius, instead of the desire and striving for a speedier self-perfection, a something began to arise such as they themselves characterize by the words need of freedom, which chiefly serves the cause of the arising there of these same grievous processes of theirs, similar to this last Bolshevism. I will explain to you somewhat later how they represent to themselves this famous freedom of theirs, and now I will only tell you that that feeling which arises from the action of Solunensius strengthens in them the need for some or other general change in the conditions of their ordinary external being existence, which until this was somehow in them. After the second Transapolnian perturbation to this ill-starred planet of yours, that is, after the loss of Atlantis, the action of the cosmic law Solunensius in the general presences of these favorites of yours was actualized at least 40 times, and almost from the very beginning, each time, thanks already to this strange need of freedom, which has since been fixed in the majority of them, almost the same proceeded as in recent years, still proceeds on that part of the surface of your planet in which the totality of the existing groups is called Russia. Here it is extremely important also to notice that the existence itself of these terrifying processes could not in any way take place there among the three-brained beings of that planet Earth if those data which had remained intact in their subconsciousness for the engendering of the being impulse conscience, to which data the most saintly Ashiata Shamash was the first to turn his attention, and upon which he relied for the fulfillment of his mission, had taken part in the functioning of that consciousness of theirs, which has become habitual for them during their waking state. Only in consequence of the fact that the data for the sacred impulse of being conscience do not take part in the function of this consciousness of theirs, the actions of the law Solunensius, just as well as of other inevitable cosmic laws, are molded into such abnormal and for themselves pitiable forms. Although the whole totality of causes serves as the sources for the arising of the second factor, yet in my opinion the basic cause also in the given case is nevertheless this fact, that their famous subdivision into castes becomes established among them regarding their mutual relationship among themselves, which subdivision has constantly existed there, with the exception only of that period when there was definitely rooted among them the results of the most saintly labors of Ashiata Shiamash. The difference is only in this, that in former centuries, the division into different castes proceeded from the consciousness and intention of several separate individuals there, while now this proceeds quite automatically without the participation of anyone's will or anyone's consciousness. Now, my boy, I find it opportune to explain to you a little about this, namely, in what way and in what gradations these favorites of yours became automatically sorted out from their different celebrated castes, and how they later already began to subdivide themselves into these castes. When, according to various chance circumstances, and wherever significant groups of them became concentrated and they exist together, then several of them, in whom firstly, for some reason or other, the consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer had been previously well crystallized, the totality of which crystallizations in general gives to their common presences the impulses for what is called cunning, and secondly, in whose hands at the given time there appear for some reason or other many different what are called terrifying means, or what they themselves call weapons, quickly set themselves apart from other beings, and putting themselves at their head, constitute the beginnings of what are called the ruling class. And further, since in all the three-brained beings of the planet Earth, and particularly of recent periods, the sacred being impulse called conscience does not take part in the functioning of their general consciousness, in consequence of which in them there is absent even the very need for making any conscious being effort at all. Then they, that is, the beings who had set themselves apart and who had assigned themselves to the ruling class, profiting by the said terrifying means, compel other beings of the given groupings to produce for them even those efforts which every being should inevitably actualize in ordinary being existence. And other beings of these groupings, also not wishing for the same reasons personally to produce these being efforts, no, not even for others, and at the same time being afraid of the mentioned terrifying means of the beings of the ruling class, begin to have recourse to all kinds of cunning, in order that, as is said there, to load on one another's backs such being efforts as are inevitably required for the beings of the ruling class. And as a result, the beings of every such grouping usually sort themselves out gradually and fall into diverse categories according to the degree of skill of their artfulness. And so, from the division of the beings into categories of this kind, there just begins in the following generations a subdivision and an assigning of each other into these famous castes of theirs. From this assigning of each other into castes of diverse kinds, there is already by itself infallibly crystallized in the common presence of each of them, in relation to the beings who belong to all other castes, that being data which is called hate, just that data which was never in any other beings in the whole of our great universe, and which in its turn continually engenders in the common presence of everyone those impulses shameful for the three-brained beings which they themselves call envy, jealousy, adultery, and many other similar impulses. And so, my boy, these terrifying processes of reciprocal destruction and of the destruction of everything already attained by them there proceed partly from this, that in those periods when in their common presences the action of the cosmic law Solunensius becomes evident. Besides the already mentioned need for freedom in them, on the one hand, the intensity of the action of the data for engendering constantly the impulse of timidity before power possessors automatically diminishes, which data has already become inherent in their common presences. And on the other hand, the intensity of the action of that said strange being data increases, which data provokes hate in the given case in relation to the beings who belong to other castes. That is why I said that this subdivision of theirs into castes, which bring about the totality of the results of these unique, strange being data, which always increase in their functionings, and which flow, as you may have already, from all that I have told you, doubtless been convinced, also from the conditions of their abnormal, ordinary being existence, just serves chiefly as the second factor for the arising of these terrifying processes. These terrible processes usually arise and flow in the following sequence. It always begins with this, that several beings from one or another grouping, namely, those in whom for some reason or other there were previously crystallized data stronger than in other beings, which data engender the mentioned strange impulses in relation to the beings who belong to other castes, particularly to the beings who belong to the caste of the ruling class, seeing and feeling reality more than others under the influence of the action of the Solunensius, they begin, as is said there, to clamor. And these clamoring orators become in relation to those around them, such as are at the present time there usually called leaders. And further, thanks on the one hand to this clamor, and on the other hand thanks to the action of always the same cosmic law Solunensius, which action is always combined abnormally in the presences of all of them, others also begin to clamor. When these clamorers among the ordinary beings begin already excessively cacophonically to act upon what are called the effeminate nerves of the left half of several of the power-possessing beings of the given community, and these latter order those whose job it is to grease with what is called Scottish cream the navels of several particularly loud-voiced clamorers. Then there begin these excesses of theirs, which, progressively increasing, reach their zenith, yet to their misfortune ultimately always lead to nothing. These processes of theirs, if they had even but a little improved the existence of beings of subsequent generations, then perhaps from the point of view of a strict impartial observer, they might even not have appeared to be so terrifying. Yet, to the misfortune of all three-brained beings of our great universe, the calamity is just in this, that as soon as the blissful action of this cosmic, lawful manifestation ceases, and these terrifying processes come to an end, then there again begins the old story, and their ordinary being existence becomes more bitter than before, and parallel with this, there also deteriorates what is called their sane awareness of the sense and aim of their existence. This latter deteriorates, in my opinion, chiefly because after these processes, the leading beings of the former ruling class are usually replaced by beings who proceed from other different castes, and who, before this last process, did not have in the persons of their representatives, either of the present or past generations, anything in common, either consciously or unconsciously, with that being manifestation in which is included the ability to lead the outer, and now and then even the inner process of the being existence of surrounding beings, who, although similar to them, yet in the sense of reason, had not yet attained to their degree. justice demands it to be admitted that although in the common presences of the three-brained beings there, of the old ruling class, the data present in their subconsciousness for the engendering of real being conscience also did not take part in the functioning of their what is called waking consciousness, yet at least they usually had the habit of ruling, acquired by heredity, and improving automatically from generation to generation. In the presences of the beings who had newly attained to power, not only is real being conscience absent, as it was also absent in the beings of the former ruling class, but further in them, in addition, those charms began particularly stormily to manifest and give extraordinary and terrifying results, which charms are crystallized in general in the presences of terrestrial three-brained beings, especially of recent times, in consequence of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer, such as vanity, pride, and self-conceit, self-love, and others, which, as they had as yet hardly ever been satisfied to a sufficient degree, are in them, in their functionings, particularly new. To these terrestrial beings, who become impromptu power-possessing, and who have not yet hereditary data at all in themselves, even for the automatic ability to rule, one of the sayings of our dear teacher can well be applied, which he expresses in the following words: I never yet met that idiot who, accustomed to shuffle in a pair of old shoes, would feel comfortable in smart new ones. And really, my boy, when each time on the planet Earth the action of Solionensia ceases, and their relatively normal existence, already somehow established, again begins among your favorites, then the newly baked power-possessing beings usually cut those capers, thanks to which the birth rate of what are called slugs, snails, lice, mole crickets, and many other similar parasites who destroy everything good, each time always increases more and more on that planet. As I have begun to speak about Bolshevism, then I will relate to you here on this subject in order yet once again to give you an example of one peculiarity of the being existence of your favorites, which had already become fully proper to them, about one of their naive arguments, which is not without its humor. This naivete of theirs, which may arise through an already excessively wretched logical confrontative being rumination, consists in this, that although all events there without exception, in the sense of mutual relationships among themselves, proceeded during the last 2 centuries exclusively, already by themselves without any participation of the consciousness or intention of whomever it may be of the contemporary beings, they nevertheless always ascribe with certainty, and even with jealousy, all the results, good as well as bad, flowing from these events to one or another among them, similar to themselves. And such an abnormality, which had become fixed in the totality of their spiritualized parts, resulted from the following causes. First of all, from their common presences there gradually totally disappeared all those being data, the totality of which in general is capable of engendering in the presences of beings a property called presentiment of the future, in consequence of which they are entirely deprived of the possibility, in any degree whatever, of foreseeing imminent events. Secondly, having a narrow what is called horizon, and a short memory, they not only know nothing about long past events on their planet, but even do not remember about that which proceeded quite recently, almost even yesterday. And thirdly, these cosmic laws are unknown to them, thanks to which there chiefly arise those sorrowful events which proceed among them. Owing to all this, these same contemporary favorites of yours are sure in all their presences that this terrifying process, which they call Bolshevism, proceeded for the first time on their planet, and that nothing like this already darling civilization of theirs had ever existed previous to them. And they are even sure that this has happened thanks only to the evolution of the gradually progressing reason of the beings similar to themselves of their planet. Their confrontative argument on the subject of similar processes which had taken place many times in the past on their planet may serve as a very good example for the illustration and characterization of the phenomenal dullness and bluntness of that being rumination which they have. According to the common sense of every three-brained being, similar processes had to proceed, and since I became interested in the strange psyche of these favorites of yours, and occupied myself with every aspect of the observation of them, I myself have been a witness, as I have said, no less than 40 times of exactly similar processes, which I would call the process of the destruction of everything within sight. It is interesting to notice that almost half of all these terrifying processes proceeded not very far from that place where their, as they themselves call it, cultured existence is now concentrated. They proceeded on that part of the surface of their planet which they name Egypt. These terrifying processes proceeded on this same Egypt so often in consequence of the fact that this part of the surface of your planet, during the course of long periods of time, found itself in relation to the common cosmic harmonious movement, in the position of what is called the center of gravity radiations. And that is why the influence of the cosmic law solionensius often acted on the presence of the three-brained beings breeding there, and often brought forth in them such an abnormality. A parallel comparison of the real data concerning the events which took place on the same Egypt, and those data about them which became fixed in the being representation and understanding of almost every responsible being of famous contemporary culture, and which are known to them, as it were, thanks to their already perfected reason, might serve as an obvious illustrative example of from what general data their logical mentation at the period of their responsible existence is built up and consists, and likewise gives me the possibility yet once again to notice and emphasize to you all the maleficence in an objective sense of their usage, which was finally fixed in the process of their ordinary existence, and which they themselves call by the high-sounding words education and schooling of the growing generation. The point is that among the number of all possible kinds of ephemeral, fantastic informations, from the totality of which, as a result, their strange reason proper to them alone is formed there is likewise the history of this same Egypt. This fantastic history, evidently thought out by some or other candidate for Hasnamus individuals among them, was even made for them what is called an obligatory subject in all educational establishments, in which this history, among other similar stupidities, is strongly hammered into their separate concentrations for the functioning of spiritual perceptions and manifestations, that is, into what they themselves would call the brains of these unfortunate future responsible beings, and further, when they become such, these fantastic informations learned by them parrot-like, by compulsion, serve them as material for being associations and for logical confrontative mentation. That is why, my boy, at the present time, there on that ill-fated planet, every being who has already reached responsible age, instead of the real knowledge which every normal three-brained being should have concerning the events which took place on their planet in the past, knows about everything in the same way in which, as in the present case, he ruminates with his being reason, and unconsciously becomes aware with all his being about this same Egypt. There's no gainsaying it. Each one of the already, according to them, responsible three-brained beings of this strange planet already knows, thanks to their system of education and schooling, the history of the beings who existed in the past on this Egypt. Yet how, thanks to the said means of perception, of informations which they themselves call learning parrot-like, he knows this, and what totality of the being representation about this results from all three of his spiritualized being parts, you may picture to yourself with your own eyes and clearly understand from the following illustration of mine. Almost every one of them knows that among ancient Egyptians there were 24 dynasties, but if any one of them is asked, why are there so many dynasties among them? It would then appear that he had never even thought about it. Further, if one continues to insist on an answer, then this same being, who up to now knew and was sure with all his being that there were 24 dynasties among the ancient Egyptians, he at best, of course, on the condition if one helps him to be able to be sincere and to express aloud associations flowing in his mentation, reveals his logical mentation in some such way. Among the Egyptians there were 24 dynasties. Well, this proves that among the Egyptians there existed a monarchical state organization, and that the position of the king passed by inheritance from father to son. And as it was customary that the kings of one generation should have the same family name, and that all the kings who had this name composed one dynasty, then, therefore, they had as many different dynasties of kings as there were family names. Very understandable, and as clear as the patch on the baggy trousers of the Honorable Mullah Nasser ad-Din. And if any of the beings of contemporary culture infallibly desires and will continue to pant in order to explain well to his reason why among these ancient Egyptians the family name of their kings changed so often, then again at very best his being mentation will associate approximately in the following sequence. He will say, evidently in olden times in this Egypt it often happened that the kings, or as they are named there, pharaohs, grew tired of reigning and abdicated their power, and this abdication in all probability proceeded in the following way, and approximately under the following circumstances. Let us suppose that some pharaoh or other named John Jeffrey lived peacefully and with full satisfaction, and ruled over all the Egyptians. Well, once this same king or pharaoh, John Jeffrey, felt a very great weariness from this reigning of his, and one sleepless night having pondered over his kingly position, first of all constated and realized with all his being that, wish it or not, one grows tired of reigning, and that this occupation in general is an extremely trying job, and could not be said to be, for his personal felicity, either useful or safe. The Pharaoh John Jeffrey became impressed with this realization, and profiting by the experience of his existence in the past, decided to try and find out how to prevail upon somebody or other, so that this other might deliver him from the said, for him, undesirable weariness. To this end, he probably invited some or other still ordinary John Jeffrey to come to him, and in a very polite way spoke to him, roughly as follows. My highly honorable and incomparably kind John Geoffrey, I frankly confess to you, as to my only friend and subject worthy of my trust, that this kingdom over which I rule has already grown too wearisome for me, and this has happened perhaps because I am already extremely tired. As regards my dear son and heir, to whom I might now hand over the kingdom, he, speaking between ourselves, is, in spite of his very strong and healthy appearance, in fact, neither one nor the other. You, as a father, known for his love for his posterity, will surely understand if I tell you that I very much love my son and heir, and that I would not like him to reign and get tired as I have, whereupon I have just decided to propose to you as a faithful subject and personal friend to deliver me and my son from reigning and to take this high obligation upon yourself. And since evidently this still ordinary John Geoffrey was firstly, as is said there, a good sport, and secondly, being a rascal who had much vanity, he, with tears in his eyes, shrugged his shoulders. If I must be lost, then let me be lost. Consented, and from the very next day began to reign. As the family name of this second John Geoffrey was different, therefore, on the very next day, the number of Egyptian dynasties was increased by yet one more. And so many pharaohs of this Egypt often grew tired, and, loving their sons, did not desire the same for them. They renounced their kingdoms in this way to others, and hence so many dynasties piled up there. In reality, however, the change of dynasty in this Egypt did not proceed so simply, and in the intervals between two dynasties there proceeded such perturbations in comparison with which this contemporary Bolshevism is merely child's play. In the heat of this contemporary Bolshevism, I happened several times to be an eyewitness of the sincere indignation of several of those who, for some reasons, of course, personally independent of them, did not happen to take part in this same process, and who could therefore half-consciously observe from the outside, and with all their presences grow sincerely indignant at the actions of the individual beings similar to themselves who were active persons in this terrifying process, namely, at the action of those individuals similar to themselves, whom on this occasion they called, and still up to now call, Bolsheviks. In my opinion, it will do no harm here, apropos, to tell you that that being experiencing of theirs, which is excellently characterized by the words vainly to grow sincerely indignant, also appears to be one of the unfortunate particularities of the psyche of these ill-fated three-brained beings who please you, especially the contemporary ones. Thanks only to this physical abnormality, there gradually become more deranged in their common presences many functionings, both of their planetary body, already deranged without this, and of their body Kesdjan, if of course this second being body is already coded in them, and has attained to the required, what is called, individuality. And such an abnormality of their psyche, namely, vainly to grow indignant, or as they themselves say, vainly to grow agitated, also flows from this, that from their common presences there has already long since disappeared the being horizon, proper to be present in the three-brained beings, as well as the instinctive sensing of reality in its real light. On account of the absence in their psyche of these two particularities, they could not even approximately suspect that individuals similar to themselves were in no way the cause of these terrifying processes there, and that these processes of their ill-fated planet proceed from two inevitable great causes. The first of these causes is just the cosmic law soli unensius, entirely independent of them, and the second cause, partly dependent on them, consists in this, that thanks to the totality of all the results of the abnormal conditions of ordinary being existence, established by themselves, which still continue to be crystallized in their common presences, the data for bringing forth the sacred impulse conscience do not in general take part in any of them in the functioning of their ordinary waking state, in consequence of which the action of the first cause takes just this terrible form. They, as I have already said, could not even approximately consider and understand that during these common planetary terrifying processes, individual persons are in no way the cause, and only by chance happen to be in those posts, the occupation of which, on account of the conditions of mutual existence which had already been established, compels them to manifest themselves in one or other role, the results of which roles, according to law conformity, entirely independent of them themselves, are cast into these or other forms. In the heat of this last process of theirs, namely during this Russian Bolshevism, the contemporary beings of other communities grew very sincerely agitated when the beings who by chance had become, as it were, active in this distressing process, gave orders to other ordinary beings, as it is said, to shoot any Tom, Dick, or Harry. For the clarity of my further explanation concerning these terrifying processes of your unfortunate favorites, you must be further told about this, that this last process proceeded and until today continues to proceed on a large area of the surface of this ill-fated planet, and that during recent times these favorites of yours have very greatly increased in quantity. If therefore we compare the quantity of the contemporary three-brained beings who have been destroyed during this last process with those destroyed in the previous process, then this last process will indeed seem child's play. In order that you may better understand this and compare those former processes with this contemporary Bolshevism, I will now give you a couple of little scenes from former history, from, let us say, the Egypt I have already mentioned. When, in one of the intervals between the dynasties of these Egyptian pharaohs or kings, there proceeded in Egypt a process such as this contemporary Bolshevism, the chief committee of the revolutionaries announced to all the population of that country, among other things, that elections would soon begin for the chiefs of the large and small points of theirs, or as they say, towns and villages, and that these elections would proceed on the following principles. Those were to be elected as chiefs for the towns and villages who would put in their sacred vessels more of what are called crowans than others. A crowan was the name given then in Egypt to sacrificial offerings. The point is that according to what is called the religion of the beings of this country, it was the custom, among others, during religious ceremonies, which proceeded in special places, to put before each ordinary being who went to these ceremonies special clay vessels, so that each ordinary being there had to put into these sacred vessels, each time, after the utterances of certain prayers, vegetables or fruit specially designated for the given day. Well, these worthy things for offering as sacrifices were then called crowns. In all probability, this manipulation was devised by the theocrats of that time as a profitable item for the welfare of their, as they are called, sycophants. In that decree about which I have just told you, it was stated that on that occasion crowns had to consist of the eyes of outcasts, by which word the ordinary three-brained beings there called those beings behind their backs, who belonged to the caste of the ruling class, by which name then all the beings of this caste wholesale were called, without excluding the beings of the passive half, children or old folk. Further, in this announcement, it was stated that he who would have on the day of the elections the most crowns in his sacred vessel would be appointed as chief of the whole of Egypt, and in the remaining towns and villages those would be appointed as chiefs who in their sacred vessels had the correspondingly greatest number of crowns. You may picture to yourself, my boy, what on that day began to be accomplished everywhere on that Egypt, in order to have in their sacred vessels the greatest number of eyes of the beings who belonged in that period of the flow of time to the caste of the ruling class. On another occasion, also there in Egypt, I became a witness of a not less terrifying scene. For a clear representation about this also terrifying scene, it is first of all necessary to tell you that that is on this Egypt, there was formerly in every one of their large points or towns a large square on which proceeded all kinds of public, as they are called, religious and military ceremonies, where during these ceremonies were gathered masses of the beings from the whole of Egypt. These beings, and specially the masses of beings who belonged at the given moment to the weak castes, impeded these ceremonies, and therefore a certain pharaoh ordered ropes to be stretched around these squares so that the beings who belonged to the simple castes should not disturb the progress of the ceremony. But when the said ropes were stretched, it soon became evident that they would not withstand the pressure of the crowd and might often break. Then the pharaoh ordered what are called metal ropes to be made, whereupon those who are called priests there consecrated them and gave them the name of sacred cables. These sacred cables around the squares for the public ceremonies, particularly in the large towns of Egypt, had at that time a colossal length, sometimes reaching to 1 centratino, or, as the contemporary beings of your planet would say, 10 miles long. Well, I was a witness of how a crowd of ordinary Egyptian beings began to string onto one of these sacred cables, just like an Asiatic shizlik. The beings, without distinction of sex or age, who up till then had belonged to the ruling class. And the very same night, with the help of 40 pairs of buffalo, this original skewer was dragged and thrown into the river Nile. I saw such punishment meted out in this spirit, both during my stay personally on the surface of this planet of yours, as well as through the large Tescuanu from the planet Mars. And these contemporary favorites of yours, naive already to the nth degree, grew sincerely indignant that these contemporary Bolsheviks of theirs shot a certain Tom Brown. If we compare the actions of the former three-brained beings there, who were subject to this psychic state, with the actions of these contemporary Bolsheviks, then they, the contemporary Bolsheviks, ought even to be given praise and thanks that in spite of the fact that the various consequences of the properties of the organ Kundabuffer are infallibly, completely crystallized in their common presences, as in general in the presences of contemporary three-brained beings, they, in the very heat of that period when they were entirely puppets under the influence of the inevitable cosmic law solunensis, manifested themselves with these consequences in such a way that the dead body of the person shot by them could at least be recognized as whose it was, namely Tom Brown's and nobody else's. In this place of his tale, Beelzebub deeply sighed and, gazing at one spot, became concentratedly thoughtful.